Oh, hi. I didn't see you there. Just squeezing in some meditation before we dive headfirst into the hype and buzz that is Black Myth Wukong. This game dropped a few short weeks ago and has absolutely dominated the internet with overwhelmingly positive reviews on Steam. Most people are loving it, others not so much. Instead, I decided to go completely blind. No trailers, no reviews, no 10 things I absolutely need to know before playing, and most importantly, no clue what to expect. Today I'm going to explore everything that this game has to offer, breaking it down chapter by chapter, dissecting every mechanic, the combat, the crafting, the good bosses, the bad ones to evaluate my overall enjoyment of the game. Stick around as I share my honest experience after more than 60 hours. Is Wukong poised to become the next big RPG? And can an unknown developer like Game Science really pull off such an enormous AAA title? If you're new here, don't forget to drop a like or sub to the channel. And if you want to support me in other ways, check out my Patreon. Alright, before we start, I just want to stress, I'm not a scholar of Chinese mythology or the lore of the Journey to the West, which this game draws its inspiration from. I'll touch on the highlights, but this review will be predominantly about the gameplay. This is Sun Wukong, legendary fighter and immortal slayer of gods. Wukong has decided that he's had enough of doing whatever it is monkey gods do all day, so he travels to the courts of the heavens to retire. Hearing the news, the heavenly bigwigs are not best pleased by Wukong's desire to go on the dole, and what would a Souls-like be without a tutorial boss to make you quit before you've even started? For now, I'm going to ignore the UI and just focus on the basics. Pressing square performs a fast, low-damage light attack. Perform multiple light attacks and you've got a light combo. Pressing triangle gives us a heavy attack, dealing more damage but taking longer, leaving you open to a counterattack. These two abilities form the delicious bread and butter of combat. Mixing square and triangle together allows you to perform a varied combo, which aside from looking cool, has its own benefits that I'll get to later. Since this one is a tutorial, we don't yet have to concern ourselves with trivialities like health and dying, which lets me learn the game without breaking something. I'm looking at you, Dark Souls 3. Black Myth Wukong is what I would call a cinematic Souls-like, balancing skill-intensive gameplay without being too controller-crushingly difficult, at least most of the time. Wukong takes its inspiration from action RPGs like Devil May Cry and God of War, while still incorporating familiar FromSoft design. Our short showdown with Erlang Sheng takes a turn for the worst, and we're hit with the famous Golden Headband Tightening spell, which according to the lore causes eternal migraines, and we're thrust back into our mountain like yesterday's jam. What a way to go. And that, my friends, is how the story begins. We take control of a new monkey, destined to reclaim the 6 relics to bring Sun Wukong back to his former glory. I'm pretty sure that's the story. I got that right. Right? Chapter 1 kicks us off in the Forest of Wolves, where we take control of the Destined One. The UI on the left shows health, mana and stamina, and on the right, the focus meter, which charges in combat and lets us spend focus points for more powerful moves. The white jar in the bottom left is the gourd, which restores health on use, recharging when you rest at a shrine. Basically, Estus flasks, with some new and unique mechanics that we'll get into later. One of the first things that stuck out to me is just how incredible the graphics look. Probably one of the best looking games that I've ever seen. If you put ray tracing on as well, you're in for a treat. Just don't forget about your graphics card temperature. I'm sure it'll be fine. There's an impressive level of detail which helps to bring the world to life. Trees swaying gently in the wind, bushes rustling as you pass by, birds and rabbits darting away when disturbed. The atmosphere and ambience is really well done. While the game follows a linear path, each of the 6 chapters are packed with hidden routes and off-track areas to uncover. The forest's expansive backgrounds and graphical fidelity create the illusion of a vast, open world, and there were times where I ended up walking into invisible barriers, and while this is slightly annoying, it's also a good sign that the environmental design is working. In the early chapters, the game feels more like a boss rush without much exploration, but as you push deeper, the maps get bigger, the paths get wider, and the enemies get nastier. When you die, and you will, you'll respawn at the nearest shrine, which lets you rest, recover, and respec your build. Make sure you're activating every single shrine you come across, because they'll be used for travel later on, unless you're playing a no bonfire run, in which case, good fucking luck.
Hey, wait! I, the keeper of Black Wind Mountain, have long been waiting for your arrival.
Activating our first shrine triggers a cutscene. In each chapter, you'll be introduced to the concept of a keeper, and in chapter 1, this small, hairy wizard takes the spot. These characters provide story context, and grant you spells and abilities, and we'll explore them as they're introduced. In terms of enemies, early game encounters in the forest are fairly straightforward. Along with our basic abilities, we can press the circle button to dodge. Getting the timing right allows you to perform what the game calls a perfect dodge, and with the right talents we can even create illusions of our character which explode on contact with enemies. Our first real boss is the Bull Guard. If you've played a video game before, you'll probably be fine. For the first few hours, I didn't really enjoy the combat. Compared to other RPGs, Wukong felt a bit floaty. The bosses and basic trash enemies don't stagger like you'd expect them to, which make the feedback of landing a blow feel off. My opinion of this eventually changed as I continued playing and unlocked talents to augment my playstyle. So, just trust me for now when I say that it does get better. Halfway through the fight, our hairy friend shows up to teach us our very first spell. In Wukong, spells are unlocked as the story progresses. They cost mana and have a cooldown, and you can only have 4 spells equipped at one time. Immobilize does what it says on the tin, freezing enemies in place for a short period of time. Do whatever you want to them, fight back, look around, or run away screaming. Casting Immobilize at the right time allows you to halt enemies mid-combo. But rather than resetting their attack patterns, they'll go right back to hitting you when the effect wears off. So you'll need to pay attention to where the enemies are, because as soon as they're free, you'll have very little time to dodge. Most of the time, landing a full combo on an immobilized enemy will cause them to stagger, which interrupts their attacks. So there's a nice level of skill involved when using this ability. Once the Bull Guard is defeated, we earn our very first spark. Sparks are earned in a few ways, from leveling up to meditating in secret spots, and these can be applied to the talent tree to beef up your combat abilities and anything else that we'll be unlocking later on. Enemies in Wukong are known as the Yao Guai, which roughly translates to demons in English. The Yao Guai come in different shapes and sizes, from rats, bears, wolves, to some really crazy enemies later on. Each chapter has its own set of locales, enemies and bosses, and the variance of enemy design is commendable. There's a lot of optional bosses scattered around as well, like this big blue baby wandering around the forest. It's worth taking your time on optional encounters for the multitude of rewards that lie in wait, but this looks terrifying, so no thanks. After the Bull Guard we meet Guangzi, who introduces the concept of Banes. When the boss attacks, you'll take a small amount of fire damage. Enough fire damage causes this meter to cap out and you'll be scorched, taking ticking fire damage until extinguished. You can remove Banes through medicines that you can craft, or by simply rolling around on the floor, which is an interesting mechanic which adds a layer of depth to the combat that you can take advantage of if you're proactive. And yes, Wukong has crafting. We'll get to that later too. Throughout the game we'll see 4 different Banes, each of these coming into play at different times depending on which chapter you're in. Scorch was the most common by far. Stop, drop, and roll to avoid spontaneously combusting. After the fight, we're rewarded with another spell. Transformations are a subcategory of spells that allow us to turn into creatures and characters on demand. With the press of a button, now we're a fire warrior, dishing out attacks that mirror those of the previous boss, which is a nice continuation of themes. When transformed, successful attacks fill up this gauge, which lets you perform special moves. Transformations look badass, but they also give you a secondary health meter, which allows you to take a few hits for free, which is really useful when you're panicking and mashing buttons. This mechanic adds a nice builder-spender style rhythm to the heat of battle, and gives the player another style of combat to build the talent tree around. There's a total of 10 different transformations scattered across the game, and a majority of these are really well hidden, so you'll need to go out of your way if you want to unlock all of them. Next, we ring a bell to let everyone know that we're here, we fight some more enemies, and then make our way up to Guanyin Temple to face Ling Zhui. Of the bosses we've fought so far, this one is the most exciting, and probably the first time since loading up the game that you'll be moderately challenged. This wolf is fast and hits like a truck, so if you're not yet comfortable with the combat, you will be after this. Defeating this boss only took me 1 or 2 tries, but we're given a taste of the potential of Wukong's combat, and this boss uses the whole arena, pouncing on top of buildings and darting around, which shows off some interesting environmental mechanics, and this whole fight felt really cinematic, especially with the Immobilize spell. Just make sure to get out of the way before he unfreezes. Delving deeper into the forest, we meet a friendly old man who teaches us about spirits, collectible objects in the world, and they come in both apple and raspberry flavors. Green spirits are scattered in plain sight. Grabbing one rewards experience and refills your gourd. More spirits means more healing charges. This is quite an interesting overlooked mechanic, and one of the ways that Wukong differs itself from its competitors. Green spirits only appear once, and they vanish forever once they've been collected, which means the first run through an area will always be easier the first time around due to the extra healing. This is a subtle yet clever design choice which encourages a smooth flow of new content by keeping the game moving forward, as opposed to the traditional Souls-like frustration when you inevitably get stuck somewhere. Of course, grabbing all of the spirits in one location and then dying means a difficult second attempt, but in some situations, this is also balanced by tossing in tougher enemies which don't respawn after being killed. Later on in the game, we'll also see these green spirits being used as a tool to gently guide the player in a specific direction. You know how some games use brightly coloured objects to display interactivity? Well, Wukong does this in its own way, and there's some very specific examples of this brilliant design that we'll see in some of the later chapters. Blue spirits, on the other hand, are harder to come by, and you'll find them by defeating tough encounters in the world. Killing an enemy and touching its spirit grants us the ability to summon it again in the future, and our first taste of this mechanic comes from the next boss. When defeated, Guang Mo drops the ability to summon Guang Mo, who then summons his own venom snakes that attack enemies for poison damage. Wonderful. Each of these mechanics, like spirits and spells, have their own separate resources, instead of relying on a single one. And I like this approach because it allows the player to engage with more of the mechanics in combat, and this design adds depth and complexity, while also increasing the skill ceiling of the game for those who want to master it. Through the talent tree, we can augment our build even further. Your talents can be changed at any time for free by visiting the nearest shrine, which is great considering that swapping builds is encouraged in Wukong. The talent tree has a variety of paths to dive into, from foundational skills which enhance your physical combat prowess, to spells and transformations. The stance tree is particularly interesting, as it allows you to choose between 3 distinct fighting styles, and these completely change the mechanics of combat. Smash stance focuses on heavy attacks at the end of combos, allowing you to power through enemies' attacks to stagger them. Pillar stance lets you twirl around like a deadly ballerina with the added bonus of avoiding ground attacks. Thrust stance turns your staff into a polearm to perform fast, heavy-hitting stab attacks and unique backflips and retreats. Swapping between these stances is as simple as pressing the D-pad, and this can be done in combat, with talents to affect how fast you can swap. By the time you've unlocked this and combined all of this together, you'll be surprised at how deep the combat gets. Alright, talents done. Time for another boss. This is where I entered gaming purgatory for the first time, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that this fight took me 20 deaths and a solid 2 hours, with some time to cry in between. Depleting the White-Clad Noble's health bar in Phase 1 causes him to enter Phase 2, so you'll need to beat this guy twice. Looking back now, it's not that big of a deal, but the White-Clad Noble will teach you a thing or two, whether you like it or not. During Phase 1, you'll be dodging long combos while partially submerged in swamp water. In Wukong, enemies don't stagger very easily, so you'll really be lucky enough to let off a full wombo combo of your own, and this is where I learned to adapt to this the hard way. Rather than looking for big damage windows, you're instead hunting for small gaps to sneak in light and varied combos. With the right talents, performing varied combos allows you to see through the enemy. Chaining light attacks causes your weapon to glow red, and that's your cue. Finishing the combo with a heavy attack allows you to spend a focus point to see through the enemy's attacks, granting invincibility frames for just long enough to hopefully stagger the boss. The game doesn't explain this mechanic explicitly, but you'll learn through the talent tree, and it completely transformed how I played Wukong. And what started as just another Souls-like started to become something unique and interesting.
Ebb and flow. You have forced my hand. Now you shall face what I truly am.
Phase 2 is where the gatekeeping begins, and now you'll be up against a big scary snake, dodging long combos with tricky delayed attack timings, which seems to be a hallmark of Souls-like games these days. To make this even more difficult, his attacks now cause AoE effects, and these can hit you from really far away. Dying is frustrating on its own, but what became even more frustrating was the annoying cutscene between Phase 1 and Phase 2. You can skip it, but it'll take almost as long to skip as it does to just let it play, and after 30 times, I was done with this fight.
You have forced my hand. You have forced.
After a few agonizing hours and learning how to be more aggressive in fights, I finally managed to beat him. Once he's dead, you'll be rewarded with a shiny new set of armor and a new weapon. Crafting armor and weapons requires recipes, obtained by defeating bosses and completing quests. Crafting can be performed at a shrine using materials gathered along the way. During the early game, the first few sets of armors are extremely cheap, and you'll be strutting around in your new set before you know it. But from chapter 3 onwards, I started to find myself lacking materials for a full set, often only being able to make 1 or 2 pieces of whatever I'd unlocked. This is an important distinction, because armor sets work like most RPGs. Equip 2 pieces, get a cool bonus. Equip 4 pieces and you'll get an even more powerful effect. So, wearing sets is encouraged. Defeating the White-Clad Noble unlocks the Serpent Scale set, which only has 3 pieces, compared to later sets having 4 or 5. When all pieces are equipped, it causes us to burn less stamina while traversing through water, a nice thematic unlock earned from beating a snake in a swamp. We roll up to the inside of the Blackwind Cave. 2 more bosses to go before the end of Chapter 1. First up, we've got the Blackwind King. Please, let this boss be easy after the last one. I'm begging you, game.
500 years. But oh yes, I always knew. One day you shall return.
Good news, the Blackwind King is easy and I managed to beat him on my first try. He packs a polearm which grants most of his attacks a staggeringly long reach, and a sip of his gourd causes an AoE fire breath attack, which can be easily dodged if you're using the pillar stance if you're feeling fruity. Every now and then he'll transform into a tiny black wisp and zoom around the arena, which can be a little tough to dodge. This one wasn't challenging, but it's a nice looking fight at least. Once defeated, the Blackwind King gets pissed and challenges us to meet him at the summit for round 2. As a reward, we're given a new spell from our favourite hairy friend. Cloudstep works just like the Blackwind King's wisp form, and this lets us become invisible for a short period of time, swapping places with an illusion of ourselves which takes the aggro of the enemies. This one is useful for a breather if you're getting bullied, but also allows the use of Unveiling Strike, which activates when attacking out of Cloudstep form. This ability has its own talent path to enhance its effects, and later on you'll even be able to add a damage multiplier, which increases as you remain hidden. We're slowly becoming more and more like Naruto, and I hope to God we get an Area 51 run by the end of the game. With our new ability under our belt, we're left with one final encounter of Chapter 1, at the summit of the mountain where Black Bear Gwai awaits. I've beaten Dark Souls, I've conquered Lords of the Fallen pre-patch on release, and I'm not tooting my own horn, but this isn't going to be that bad, right? Black Bear Gwai is easily the hardest thing you'll have had to do since loading up Black Myth Wukong. He's got some lightning fast attacks, and being such a chonker, he's difficult to stagger, so you'll need to be smart about spending your focus points. Just like in the swamp, we learned weaving heavy and light attacks together is the key to staggering the bear, and doing this several times in a row allows us to create a chain of staggers, allowing for defense through proactive aggression. Learning when to go all in, and learning when to play safe is a key lesson of this fight, and one you'll need to learn to progress. Black Bear Gwai has a few tricks up his sleeve that echo abilities from his previous encounter. He'll transform into a wisp and attack from multiple angles, which is a nice iteration of mechanics that we've already mastered. While the game won't explicitly spell it out, using the Immobilize spell on the boss in his wisp form will cancel its effect, giving us more time to counterattack. It's this little dance of discovery that adds a layer of creativity to the combat, and something you don't usually find in other Souls-like games. Even though the difficulty curves off a cliff, it's an enjoyable fight, and it's very satisfying to smack the boss with a light combo and see him physically react to those attacks. And just when you think you're winning, Blackbeard's senpai will light himself on fire, because why not? Now you'll need to deal with fire damage, which can cause Scorch, so you'll need to roll around like a madman to avoid being turned into ready salted crisps, or whatever flavour you'd prefer. This fight becomes a battle of attrition due to the boss's enormous health pool and ticking fire damage. Spells cost mana, some more than others, so learning which abilities should be spent and which should be saved is another skill that you'll need to master, because if you're dead, you're not going to be dealing much damage. Bosses with extremely large health pools are a recurring theme in Wukong, and this is a design choice that I don't necessarily agree with. Here we have our first taste of this, but especially in some of the later encounters, this became a detriment to the gameplay. I'm looking at you, Captain Wisevoice. And while we're on the topic of issues, I had one main problem with this fight: the camera. Another issue that we're going to see time and time again. The sheer girth of this bear makes it difficult to see what's happening on screen, especially when there's fire and lava spewing all over the place. And things get even worse when standing near the edge of the arena, where the camera sometimes clips through the boss. Unless you've always dreamed of a front row seat to the inside of a bear's blazing asshole, you're going to want to move out the way. After 3 hours of desperate sobbing, I managed to beat the bear and wrap up Chapter 1. In a fit of childlike rage, the king swoops in and steals our first relic. After some groveling, he gives it back. And when the game said relic, I was expecting, a trinket, not a bird. There's 6 relics in total, one for each chapter, and each one is a piece of Wukong, with the first relic being his craving eyes. Chapter 1 surprised me. Initially I wasn't really feeling it, but by the end I was impressed with Black Myth Wukong. The lore, the combat, the graphics, the atmosphere. Every main roadblock teaches the player something new and solidifies our understanding of the combat system, and this only gets better in Chapter 2. As a reward for beating Chapter 1, we're given some tasty loot and a beautifully animated cutscene. These are worth watching, because every single one is fantastic. Chapter 2 begins with a headless monk, serenading us with his Sangjiang, and he'll take on the role of the keeper, replacing the hairy wizard from the forest. And things aren't looking great for our poor monkey, who's taken a hail of arrows in his sphincter. I hope that's not foreshadowing. New mechanic. Enemies with shields have a secondary health bar to protect against frontal attacks, so you'll have a choice. Run around and smack them from behind, or break their shield first. This is simple enough on its own, but when you throw in other enemy combinations like archers, you end up with some interesting encounters. Archers are a minor nuisance in Chapter 1 because they're often found alone, but they can be a real threat if you get caught in a combo. In Chapter 2, you'll be up against both enemy types simultaneously, with archers being stationed in difficult or even impossible to reach places, which is another nice iteration of previously learned mechanics. In the talent tree, there's a whole section dedicated to the staff spin, an ability which lets us deflect incoming arrows, Jedi style. If you go far enough into this ability, you can learn to deflect while moving, and even as a melee attack. Nice. The desert in general is a lot more open and larger than the forest, and the balance between boss encounters and exploration is something that's introduced gradually. Eventually a shady fox crosses our path, and politely asks us to deal with a clamorous pest in his garden. Unfortunately for this frog, nothing can top the bear that just consumed 3 hours of my life, so this electric amphibian is trivial. Once the fox croaks his last croak, our foxy friend rewards us with some evil repellent medicine, reducing damage taken for a short period of time. We'll be seeing Mr. Fox again later, but for now we've unlocked the ability to use medicines, consumable items that grant temporary buffs in combat. Later in Chapter 2 we'll unlock the ability to craft temporary and permanent medicines, but for now, another boss. Or I should say, a duo of bosses. The Rat King and the second Rat Prince. These are the first mandatory encounters of Chapter 2, and our very first gank boss, so my butt cheeks are firmly clenched. But it turns out this fight is a cakewalk. The Rat King stands atop pillars and hurls down at us while the prince engages in melee combat on the ground. This fight involves luring the prince into the pillars to stun him, letting you deal damage safely. What the game doesn't tell you is that if the prince takes a swing at the pillar holding the king, it'll crumble, letting you bash the king's face in without interruption. This fight is easy, but there's actually two possible outcomes. If you take out the prince first, you'll end the fight. If you decide to topple the king as well, you'll unlock a new spirit to summon in future battles. If you miss it here, you'll need to go all the way through New Game Plus to find it. The first prince of the Flowing Sands shows up very shortly afterwards, and if you killed the king in the previous fight, you'll need to summon this boss yourself. If the king is alive, however, you'll watch as he summons the boss for us. How polite. The first prince is also a cakewalk, and using what we've learned about combos and dodging is more than enough to take him down. From time to time he'll do a charge, and if you angle this right you can get him to punch a hole in the wall nearby, and this unlocks a secret passageway, and even an item to summon even more powerful bosses.
We got a #1 victory royale, yeah, Fortnite, we about to get down. 10 kills on the board right now.
Run around the desert grabbing Buddha's eyeballs from statues for whatever reason, and then get blown up by enemies that explode after death. Wonderful. The desert offers its fair share of interesting combat, like this encounter in a valley with enemies on all sides. You could choose to take out each enemy one by one, or slide down the sand dunes and run away from your problems in style. The sand mechanics in Wukong are gorgeous, and you'll see these dynamic trails left behind as you move around. Paired with the stunning graphics and lighting system, this area feels exactly what you'd expect from a proper next-gen video game. You can even see your character's staff dragging along behind, which is really cool. At the bottom of the hill we meet Mandolin Man again, who teaches us another spell, the Pluck of Many. This spell is by far my favourite spell in the game, and using it will summon an army of clones. It consumes a lot of mana though, so you'll need to use it wisely in long boss fights, but it's really useful for taking down tough encounters, especially when you're outnumbered. The Pluck of Many got me through a lot of tough encounters that I might have otherwise struggled with, but it's just such a nice ability, both thematically and mechanically. Eventually, we come across another boss. The Stone Vanguard is another tough cookie, using powerful punches and sweeping AoE attacks. Unlike most bosses, the Vanguard is very slow, which you can use to your advantage, but the real difficulty of this fight boils down to his extremely large health pool, which translates to a longer fight with more time to make mistakes. Dying in this fight is also a lot more punishing, because of the time investment involved. The best way to beat this guy is to channel your inner monkey, run away, and collect those butter eyeballs that I mentioned earlier. Collecting all 6 allows us to summon another optional boss from a nearby pile of rubble, and with the help of Shigan Dang, my job here is done. Well, that was easy. Oh no. Apparently Shigan Dang isn't on our side either, and now we're forced to fight him as well. Have we made things worse? Hard to tell. Here I noticed an example of another awkward mechanic which will rear its head in the later chapters. The first time you do this, the Vanguard will fight back against Shigan Dang, which lets us fight without interruption. If you lose and repeat the fight, the Vanguard will now be dead, which leaves us without help. This is another example of how Wukong likes to give the player an advantage the first time around, and even though Shigan Dang will begin the encounter at lower health, you'll still be punished for repeating the fight. Instead, I ran away screaming, all the way to our next destination, the Crouching Tiger Temple. And after a stupidly long walk up some organ-covered steps, we encounter an ominous tiger bathing in a pool of blood.
Bloody hell! What's the hold up this time? Suck your offerings and go breed more rats. If you dare to muck up the king's practice again, I'll serve your dimwit son up for supper, myself.
Aside from the fact that this cute fellow looks like he's just devoured an entire family, his Cockney accent is simply charming. What a lovely fellow. The Tiger Vanguard uses delayed sword slashes that require precise timing and patience. He'll also leap into the air and slam down from above, which has a tendency to fuck the camera up, and we'll be seeing even more egregious examples of later bosses doing this as well. Because the camera tends to lock on to enemies after they disappear, it'll take a lot of brain rewiring to not learn to press the target button, which will instead cause you to untarget the boss, rather than retargeting it. The Tiger also has an interesting defensive move, where he'll turn himself into stone for a short period of time. Attacking into this can cause you to become staggered, so you'll need to learn when to back off. And one more minor annoyance. When the Tiger Vanguard attacks, his fists sometimes produce impact sounds that sound like you're being hit, even if you manage to successfully dodge. This can make it difficult to tell when you're safe to commit to an attack. It's a small issue that never cropped up with any other encounter, but it also causes a slight disconnect in what was otherwise a pretty decent fight. After defeating Tony, our headless friend teaches us another spell. Aside from having a funny name, Rock Solid lets us turn into a rock, just like the boss did, and this is a clever mechanic. During combat, you can activate the spell to turn into an invulnerable stone for a short period of time. With this, you can avoid damage, but you can also use it to stagger enemies as well, which effectively enables you to parry just like you would in a traditional Dark Souls game. We'll be unlocking other ways to empower this spell through our healing gourd to grant free uses of this ability later on as well. Open the hidden blood door, fight a group of horrible enemies, and in the basement we meet Mr. Fox again. Remember this one from earlier? Well, you'll find him permanently in the basement of this temple, and now he'll allow us to use his super special furnace to craft medicines. Medicines are consumable power-ups, and by now you've probably noticed that you can find plants and herbs dotted around the map. But be careful, because sometimes you might end up with more than you bargained for.
Hello there.
As an extra special reward, Mr. Fox allows us to craft and apply celestial medicines, which are permanent stat upgrades that can be purchased with rare materials. There's quite a few of these celestial medicines available, but the amount you can craft will be limited by the number of mind cores that you found along the way. The more powerful medicines require 3 mind cores, while the less potent ones take 1 or 2, and these can be dropped by bosses and tough encounters. You can reset these choices at any time, so this adds another layer of choice and variety onto the top of our build. The final encounter of Chapter 2 comes just a short walk away from this shrine, inside the eye of a tornado, and I'm praying that this will be easier than the black bear from Chapter 1. Okay, I take it back. I'm not exaggerating when I say that this fight is the hardest thing that we've had to face so far. And in retrospect, it's one of the hardest fights in the game. In Phase 1, the Yellow Wind Sage will attack with some sweat-inducing combos, and he'll use ranged attacks if you get too far away. After a quick beating, he'll start to teleport in and out of view while striking from various angles, and I died a few times just trying to figure this out. This boss is hard, but there were a few issues which made this harder than it needed to be. Halfway through the fight, he'll conjure big tornadoes which begin to engulf the arena, obscuring vision and limiting movement. Because the boss likes to hang out around the sides of the arena, there were times when this stopped me from being able to attack the boss, while he was able to attack me without issue. The only way to deal with this is to stand smack bang in the middle of the room, which then becomes a problem of its own due to the mini tornadoes that he'll summon when he's on low health. These spin around and whip you into the air on impact, causing damage and cancelling whatever attack you were charging at the time, so you can't stand in the middle of the room either. The camera makes it extremely difficult to see during this tornado phase because of the sheer number of particle effects going off, and the boss also has a huge amount of health. Having a lot of HP is fine when used sparingly, but like with a lot of flagship bosses like the Yellow Wind Sage and the Black Bear, more health just means a longer, more drawn out fight, which causes frustration when you die, but also makes it harder to learn the later phases of the boss, because you'll end up dying before even getting there. And I'm not sure why, but there seems to be some sort of randomization in how bosses behave. Now and then the sage would execute attacks from later phases, even when his health was high. And other times I would notice the tornadoes wouldn't appear until the boss was almost dead. And this leads me to suspect that Wukong has some sort of system in place to randomize difficulty, which I assume is based on your current performance. But I have no proof of this. Let me know down below. Am I going crazy or did anyone else notice this? Nevertheless, I was completely stuck. I spent over 3 hours here just dying and retrying, but I just couldn't beat him. Eventually I gave up and decided to revisit some of the older locations in the hopes of getting stronger. After being unlocked in Chapter 1, the Shen Monkey allows us to customize our healing gourd through a mechanic known as brewing. Brewing lets us change the properties of our gourd, increasing the amount of sips, changing the liquid to enhance healing power, and later on even the ability to add small buffs, which proc every time you take a drink. And these range from temporarily restoring more health over time, or even giving you the ability to add synergies to your spells, like granting a free use of Rock Solid, or applying healing to our Pluck of Many clones. There's a lot of different options available, and you'll want to revisit this alcoholic monkey every now and then just to see what else you've unlocked.
Remember, young friend, a sip makes one tipsy, many sips make you hammered.
And speaking of alcoholics, the keen-eyed among you might have noticed the drunken boar chilling out in the desert of Chapter 2, more formally known as the Yellow Robe Squire. If you talk to him, he'll ask you to sober him up. So off we go to collect some snape grass, chocolate dust, and a bucket of... oh, no, wait, wrong game again. Sobering up the squire requires a sobering stone found in a nearby village, and after giving it to him, he'll reward us by trying to beat us up. Nice. Thankfully this guy is easy, and after being decimated by my 500 clones, he reveals a secret area. In the kingdom of Sahali, we run into a past tense version of the Yellow Wind Sage, and he asks for our help. Yep, I know, my brain hurts too. The sage shows off a cool new riff on his drum kit which summons Fuban, an extremely large and menacing beetle. Fuban is an enjoyable fight, and he's a lot easier than his mammoth proportions would suggest. He's invincible to most types of attacks, except for 2 targetable claws on his torso, and every now and then he'll burrow into the sand, and you'll need to dodge like your life depends on it. Above ground, his attacks are relatively easy to dodge. At half health, the Yellow Wind Sage comes to our rescue and saves the day by banging his drum again, which stuns the boss. And when this happens, I sit back and relax, while the poor beetle gets cyberbullied. Fuban is one of the first encounters where I noticed FPS issues, which isn't a surprise considering how big the boss is, and all of the sand mechanics going off in such a big arena. But this is an issue that becomes a common problem, and it gets worse as the chapters progress. Anyway, after all of that nonsense, we're rewarded with the vessel, and we can use it to nullify the effects of the tornadoes in the Yellow Wind Sage fight. Vessels are another small addition to our arsenal, and they require ki to use, and this is a resource shared between spirits and transformations. These items are very situational, and they're completely optional, but they'll help a lot in some very specific encounters. With the Wind Tamer equipped, the Yellow Wind Sage becomes extremely easy, partly because it trivializes most of the mechanics, but also, after dying for 4 hours straight, I was already pretty comfortable with this fight. With the Wind Tamer, I beat the Yellow Wind Sage on my first go, so technically I beat him first time, and that's an impressive achievement, if I do say so myself.
You disciple, you're a fool. You stole Erlang's spell and snatched the great sage's relic. You even took your master's heed, just for a short reign over this barren valley.
Chapter 2 was enjoyable. Even though I'm not really much of a desert fan, it has more content and less of a linear feeling than Chapter 1. It's also considerably more difficult, and from here on out, things don't get any easier. After the arid desert of the Yellow Wind Ridge, we arrive in the snowy mountains of Chapter 3, where we're introduced to a small fat baby who turns into a statue. This location actually contains a whole secret area which can be unlocked after beating the game and every other secret location, and these bosses are no joke, even with the best gear. Making a return are the awesome sand mechanics, this time in the form of snow, which looks incredible. Beating Chapter 2 also hooks us up with a new set of frost-resistant armor, which is another good example of relevant rewards being used for challenges ahead. That said, Chapter 3 onwards, crafting becomes a lot more resource intensive, and you'll be requiring even more rare materials to craft. This isn't a bad design choice, but it does mean that you'll need to think twice before committing to a new set. Chapter 3 is a big step up in difficulty, both in terms of boss design and normal enemies as well. Progression started to feel less like a straightforward boss rush, and more intricate with extended level design. We're also introduced to some more new enemies, dormant statues which spring to life if you get close, so you'll need to constantly watch your back. Using auto-lock is a great way to deal with this, as you'll be able to see which enemies are actually enemies, even though the dormant statues also grant experience when broken. Technically that must mean that they're alive. Way to go, game. Now I feel guilty. These statues also have a unique death animation, and they'll swing blindly before crumbling away, so it's easy to take chip damage if you're not spatially aware. A short frosty walk up a hill leads us to our first boss, the Macaque Chief. This guy is easy, a mini-boss at best. He's got some fast attacks, but as with most easy bosses in Wukong, just pop every ability you have and go to town. This isn't the last time we'll be seeing the Chief though. And another new enemy, and one of my least favourite in the entire game. These stupid little fat Batmen. These guys attack without a wind-up, and if they hit you first you'll likely take a ton of damage, because fighting airborne enemies is always really tricky. They aren't very difficult, but they serve the purpose of whittling down your resources, and kind of remind me of the guy from the Hercules animation. Anyone else? Eventually we find a shrine and a bird nudges us to collect the third relic from within. Maybe Chapter 3 will be pretty short after all.
See that temple on the lake? Therein lies the thing you seek. The lord of this land is away. Seize it now and leave.
Kang Jinglong, now that you are ready, go and weigh up this one for your master. See if this monkey merits a place amongst my disciples.
Kang Jinglong is an absolutely gorgeous white dragon, but don't let her appearance deceive you. Her thunder attacks are painful. Thunder is similar to fire, but instead of damage over time, becoming shocked causes you to take double damage, and this can get you killed very, very quickly. After a rough start, I got wrecked, so I decided to retreat and equip the best shock-quelling medicine money can buy. We've also got the Thunderbolt Horn Soak from an earlier encounter, and this can be applied to our gourd, which increases shock resistance with every sip. In most Souls-like games, status effects are something that you really need to pay attention to, but in Wukong, there were very few times where I actually cared enough to change my loadout. This might have some of you breathing a sigh of relief, but honestly, I think the developers could have done more with these mechanics to require the player to engage with them, especially when you have new mechanics like the brewing system. And another nitpick regarding crafting, it's really annoying having to go all the way back to previous chapters to apply gourd upgrades or to craft medicines. After I got used to it, it was fine, but in the beginning I had to find myself using Google to remember where I needed to go. If only Black Myth Wukong had a hub area, right? Well, fun fact, Wukong does have a hub area, but I managed to miss this completely, and to this day after completing the game I still haven't unlocked it. Even with all of our newfound upgrades, we're still in for a tough fight. Kang Jinglong, in my opinion, has a few glaring design issues. Many of her abilities are well telegraphed and easily dodged if you remain calm. She's got the usual long delayed combo and a grab animation where you'll be whipped into her thunderous jaws and slammed down into the ice. If you're hit by this, you'll either die immediately or very soon afterwards. Unlike most flying bosses in other games, Kang Jin likes to stay airborne, which makes fighting back almost impossible. And this is partly due to the camera problems, but also when you're finally able to attack, she'll probably be up in orbit. To deal any damage in this encounter, you'll need to carefully dodge. and spend most of your time desperately sprinting just to get close enough to fight before she flies off again. This was actually quite frustrating, but realistically, if I was a Thunder Dragon in real life, I probably wouldn't land either. When you do finally manage to get off a spicy combo and stagger, she'll be stunned for quite longer than you usually would expect, which makes me believe that this is how the developers intended to balance this fight, but it just doesn't feel right. It's a shame, because from a visual perspective, this fight is one of my favorites. Somehow I was able to kill Kanjin after only 2 attempts, but I feel like I got really lucky, and could easily have been stuck here for several hours. With the dragon dead, it's time to talk about my #1 favorite location in Black Myth Wukong. And no, that's not a joke. I really did love this location. From what I've seen online, this part was polarizing. Personally, I loved it, but I've seen a lot of people on the internet who would disagree.
You have chosen your way. This time, there will be no easy way out.
We awaken, scared and confused, in a strange, prison-like structure towering into the heavens. The Pagoda realm is made up of several floors, requiring us to navigate tough enemy encounters, and here we'll be introduced to several new mechanics. And this is the first time in Wukong where I felt like I was playing a Souls-like game. No bosses, no cutscenes, just you and the enemies. Let me know in the comments, I'm really interested to know what you guys thought of the Pagoda realm. This area is easily the most difficult that we've encountered so far. The layout is like a maze, and the verticality of the environment makes things larger than they first seem. The winding, narrow corridors also tend to have enemies tucked away, waiting to ambush you, and you'll be forced to deal with long, hazardous bridges with deathly drops below, and archers sprinkled in for good measure. So at times fighting back was nearly impossible, and one misstep means you'll be sent right back to the start. While exploring, in the background you'll start to hear spooky chimes, and slowly the world begins to melt away. This mechanic is similar to the Umbral Realm from Lords of the Fallen, and originally I thought that this happened at random. It's actually on a 3-minute timer until you beat the area boss, and enemies will start to glow red and deal more damage, and your health bar will be halved. Wonderful. Once this transition occurs, you'll also begin to encounter creepy, Silent Hill-esque lantern bearers, and these guys patrol the corridors, making the whole area feel intense and scary. This is another mechanic which is never directly explained in game, and it was just so unexpected, and you get to hear awesome industrial horror music combined with the frantic banging of drums and onward march of otherworldly enemies, and I really like it. Except for the targeting issues. The Pagoda Realm is one of the first times where I noticed myself having to use the auto-target system to fight groups of enemies. Pressing the analog stick down lets you lock onto the nearest enemy. Pressing it again lets you swap between them, and this is great for keeping track, but this feels awkward and clunky at times, especially in group encounters. After an hour or two of spelunking, I finally made it to the top. Just gotta follow that light to the next shrine. Just a few more steps and... At the top we enter the Mani Wheel, leaving behind one of my favourite locations and onwards to one of my least favourite boss fights in the whole game. So far we've faced a few frustrating fights, but there's been nothing quite as bad as Captain Wisevoice. While the concept and aesthetic of this boss is great, the execution is somewhat lacking. He's got a metric ton of health, and I mean as much health as the Black Big Y and the Yellow Wind Sage combined, and this means you'll be fighting for an upward of 5 minutes per attempt, even if you play the fight perfectly. And for me, this was a bit much when I had to fight this boss nearly 20 times. His mechanics are actually very interesting, fighting to the death with a biomechanical machine as it gradually falls apart. Now and then he'll go into overload, blaring out huge beams of light in all directions. There's also multiple phases to this fight, with the inclusion of some environmental mechanics. You'll be forced to move to dodge electrified pools, but when the floor glows red you'll need to stand still, or you'll take a big hit of damage. The combination of these mechanics, the room and the music going wild is really exciting, and this requires a dance of precise movement and sudden halts to avoid death. The easiest way to deal with this fight is just to stand directly underneath the boss, wailing on his leg. Once he takes enough of a beating, he'll fall over, exposing his golden dome, which causes him to take even more damage. You'll need to repeat this process 3 or 4 times before eventually killing him, which is why it takes so long. The biggest issue I had with this fight was again, the camera. Y's voice is so large, and being required to stand underneath him makes it impossible to tell what's going on, especially when electricity starts flying everywhere and he starts stomping his feet. Combine all of these issues with the long duration of each attempt, only to fail at the very end due to a stomp that you couldn't see, and all of this makes this whole encounter really annoying, and I didn't enjoy this boss in the slightest. In the end, I just looked up a guide, and button mashed my way to carpal tunnel induced victory. With Captain Shitsucker out of the way, we move on to the Bitter Lake. Along the way, we fight the Makar Captain again for a second time, and we unlock a new spell. The Ring of Fire spell creates a barrier of fire that enemies can't enter, and this makes it incredibly useful for when you need a moment to breathe, cry, or time to cast a spell. You can't use both Ring of Fire and Immobilize at the same time though, so you'll be faced with a choice depending on the situation. Eventually we find a spaceship stuck in between two rocks, and I think there seems to be someone inside, slinging insults at the poor woman nearby. The game then decides to reveal that we've been floating on a giant turtle all of this time, and this is getting a little weird. This poor woman is Kanjin Star, and she's the human form of the dragon we fought earlier. Her main gimmick comes in the form of AoE attacks, which are easy to dodge after some practice. After taking enough damage, she'll transition into a soft phase 2, letting lightning across the arena, which can be tricky to avoid if you were panicking like me. She can also transform back into her dragon form, but this time it's much easier to deal with because you can actually get close enough to attack. I don't know, I always find fighting humanoid enemies in Souls-like games is more preferable, compared to huge hulking behemoths, because the combat tends to feel more natural, but this is just my personal opinion. In contrast to the majority of the other fights, Kanjin Star tends to use a lot of audio telegraphs rather than visual animations to indicate incoming damage. She'll use spoken words to announce her next attack, which is actually a really cool distinction between most other fights. Other than that, it's pretty easy.
Master's right. Monkeys are set in their ways.
This small angry boar is Zubaji, the previous companion of Wukong, and he'll be joining us for the rest of the game.
What took you so long? Constipation? I was nearly cooked alive in there.
This guy adds a nice element of whimsy to the story, spouting nonsense and quarrelling with anyone nearby, and he'll even help us out in combat. It's like having your own personal Yoda. Just make sure not to walk off if he's talking. He doesn't like that.
Hi! Don't cut me off while I'm speaking.
At this point, the game begins to open up, and we're offered plenty of optional routes with hidden bosses and treasures around every turn. The main story takes us to a large mountain range where we're reunited with a familiar fat baby. Next quest, find and hold Buddha in our heart, while our new friend has a heated debate with a rotund child. Basically, look around for 4 statues and activate them. And this is a nice way to continue Chapter 3's theme of storytelling and exploration. Once we've been successfully indoctrinated into Buddhism, we ascend a large mountain and enter Ecstasy Valley, the last location of Chapter 3. Ecstasy Valley, aptly named, is single-handedly the largest, most intricate location we've had the opportunity to explore so far, and it's really easy to get lost in the densely packed forest, which is filled to the brim with interesting enemies, and even more optional bosses, like this frosty frog. The final destination of Chapter 3, Thunderclap Temple, can be accessed through a lengthy walk through the forest. Compared to the rest of the game, this region has long stretches between shrines, making it even more punishing to die because you'll get sent back 3 or 4 minutes. It's also really difficult to pinpoint which direction you're moving, and there were times where I ended up doubling back on myself, ending up further away than where I first started. This is easy to avoid if you're careful and take your time, but this is one of the first times in the game where we've specifically had to do this. Ecstasy Valley has some really interesting and unique enemies, and you'll be fighting through a slew of zombies, scythe-wielding rats and massive menacing giants, which scared the shit out of me the first time I saw them. At the temple gates we encounter another mandatory boss, Captain Calphawave, another mediocre boss with an interesting appearance. Just tank and spank and watch out for his AoE attacks. Easy. The hardest part about this fight is the 3 to 4 minute walk you'll need to do if you die. After killing Calphawave, we ascend to the top of Thunderclap Temple, dodging hordes of enemies along the way. Blue giants, blind monks, ranged enemies, men with boulders, mages on the stairs, 2 more giants, and even a short mini-boss thrown in for good measure. And if you die, you'll be fighting all of this all over again. Right at the top, we're rewarded with one final shrine. And this one is really easy to miss, and you really don't want to have to make that walk again while fighting the very last boss of Chapter 3.
Ages ago, Jinjanza and I were peers. Ever questing with goodwill, he was. His nature made him question the supremacy of us beyond mortal woe and grief. He deemed all souls could be akin to us. Why then do we tower whilst others merely kneel and offer? He asked. I told him the others are less than us. His misstep cast him back into the endless cycle. Why bet on the sutra when one oneself can be a Buddha?
Kneel before the Buddha of the future.
Yellowbrow is easily the most cinematic fight we've encountered so far, and after tackling the other chapters, I was dreading the idea of being stuck here for hours on end. Fortunately, this is the easiest end boss of the game, but it does go on for a while, with 3 and technically 4 phases. In phase 1, he teleports around the room, firing off thunder magic and long, elaborate combos with his staff. Visually, this was one of the most impressive encounters we've seen so far, but despite his looks, you shouldn't have much trouble with this phase. Once his health is depleted, he'll transition into phase 2, which also resets our cooldowns and health, so it's worth popping everything you have while you have the chance. In phase 2, we'll be fighting inside Yellowbrow's sack, against a souped-up version of the Makaki Chief, which I wasn't expecting at all. Luckily, Tsubashi arrives, which makes this second phase a cakewalk. The Chief has some enhanced abilities this time around, and he'll fire red beams from his sword like Dracula, so quick dodges are key. I really like the aesthetics of this fight. In the background, you'll hear epic orchestral choirs, while a gigantic Yellowbrow taunts us like a toy in his doll's house. Defeating the Chief transitions to phase 3, and yeah, we are still going. This time we take control of the Makaki Chief while Yellowbrow reigns over us. We get to use his attacks to mow down enemies, which was unexpected, but actually pretty cool. You can unlock the Makaki Chief as an optional transformation after beating him here for a 3rd time, which is nice if you're bored of the Red Tide spell. After a gauntlet of weirdness, we're up against Yellowbrow again, this time one-on-one. Dying at any point during this long fight respawns you at the start of each phase, and this is the main reason why this fight was manageable. If I had to start again after every death, I would have probably already turned the game off in anger. In his final phase, Yellowbrow pulls out all the stops with his thunder magic, trapping you in his thundery prison while he bombards you with spells. Occasionally he'll turn himself into gold, which requires you to use heavy attacks to break. If you don't manage to break this in time, you'll be hit with an explosion, which basically means instant death. One notable detail about this fight is that it actually discourages you from using spells, which is unusual compared to every other boss. For example, using the Pluck of Many spell to summon clones will actually cause them to turn on you instead, making it almost impossible to use this to your advantage. This is one of the only times that this mechanic is used in the game, and it's never explained, so at the time I had no idea why my clones were attacking me. I've got another unproven theory here, that using spells actually causes Yellowbrow to use his golden form more often. But to make this fight easier, it's best to avoid using spells altogether. Overall, this fight stood out to me for its dramatic storytelling, which is a nice change of pace from the controller smashingly hard encounters like the Bear and the Sage.
I saw how this would end for you long ago. Keep fighting for others, and in time, you shall fall by their hand. I, Yellowbrow, fight solely for myself.
Chapter 3 as a whole focuses more on fleshing out the story and challenges the player with exploration and open world encounters. And this is a theme that we'll see more of as we enter Chapter 4 and beyond. In the 4th chapter, we'll be exploring the creepy crawly 8-legged nightmare that is the Webbed Hollow. If you're not a fan of spiders, I'd recommend covering your eyes. While the previous chapters have had their ups and downs, this one left me with some mixed feelings. There will be some moments ahead where the gameplay shines, but also some of it made me want to deposit my controller into a blender. Let's just say, Chapter 4 was definitely not in my top 3. Immediately I'm sensing a rapid spike in difficulty with new, nightmare-inducing arachnids, and a sprinkling of horrid tiny spiders, who will have no problems ganging up and poisoning you. The good news, Zubaji has returned to lend us a hand in combat, which makes the times when he does decide to show up a lot easier. I'm not using him as a meat shield, how dare you. Shortly afterwards we find some more spiders, find a village and then break in by transforming into a pig, and then we meet the first boss, the second sister. This lovely lady is a member of the family that we'll be all too familiar with by the end of this chapter. Who's that Pokemon? Well, it's Spider Lady of course. A tricky encounter, mostly because of her large, gooey torso, which will hover off the ground, which makes her hard to hit unless you're close enough to smell her breath. Her attacks also deal poison damage, which can contribute to a lot of extra damage, so I'd recommend using some anti-miasma medicine. Once she's been defeated, she slinks off into the Webbed Hollow while our friend chases behind in a fit of rage. He'll be fine, right? Instead, we get to take the slow route, and after jumping down into a massive sticky pit, we get assaulted and wake up in a cave. I'm pretty sure this is how most horror movies begin. Aesthetically, this is one of my favourite locations, and as you explore you'll notice gorgeous environmental effects like rocks and dust trickling down from the open sky, which adds a nice sense of movement to the environment. Dotted around you'll also encounter small villages, which make the area feel expansive and open, despite being completely submerged underground. Oh, of course, don't think you've escaped the flying enemies either. If I've not already made it clear, I hate flying enemies, and I really hate them here because Chapter 4 is crawling with them. Hovering with them? Whatever. Archers are also placed in hard to reach spots, and aside from providing the extra challenge, they're also used as breadcrumbs, guiding you to hidden locations that you might have otherwise missed. We're also introduced to a few more chapter-specific mechanics. Eggs. Delicious. Eggs are scattered around everywhere, and getting too close to them triggers a delightful hatching animation which spawns a spider after a few seconds. If you're quick, you can smash these to bits before they hatch, but trying to do this in the middle of combat is difficult, especially when you don't know which eggs contain new enemies. It's a nice way to add a sense of urgency, and some extra awareness will be required, which adds nicely to the horror vibes. Just sprint around and make some omelettes. You'll also find these egg sacs swinging ominously from the ceiling. When disturbed, they don't spawn enemies, but instead they'll sprout arms and swing wildly, which causes other eggs around them to wake up as well, which is pretty gross. Collect a teapot which turns into a gourd upgrade, find another shrine, and then this happens. The Hand of Buddha is a bizarre encounter, and it takes place in a very long, narrow corridor. He'll flail his long magical fist at you while moving from end to end, and if you get too far away, he'll pelt you with magic spells, so staying close is recommended. After enough damage, he'll morph into a disgusting, creature, whatever this is, and fill the room with belching poison, so you'll need to squeeze past and attack from behind. It's not very often that you get to fight bosses designed for narrow arenas, so this was a really interesting detour. But as you might expect, the camera does not share my enthusiasm, and it has a tendency to clip into the walls, but I appreciate the varied design. Eventually we come across Zubaji again, and this time the whole spider family is joined for the celebration of a wedding, and our friend, the groom. I'll be honest, story-wise I haven't got a fucking clue what's happening, but this cutscene gives us a helpful hint to not look into her eyes, which you'll be wise to remember for an upcoming boss battle. So now we've got an objective. Rescue Zubaji before he's wedded off and doomed to make spider babies for all eternity. But unfortunately our friend is looking a little worse for wear.
What on earth? It was one merry night, and now she wants to take my life. You're following me like a shadow. Can't you do anything without me? Nitwit! Spare me this burden.
It's a little strange seeing this guy as a boss, because now he's larger than us. Our boy has grown up. Zubaji uses a combination of the same attacks we've seen in the previous chapters, launching both his rake and fiery black goo in our general direction. Phase 1 is a breeze, and after beating him he'll retreat somewhere close by, and less than 30 seconds later you'll find him waiting in a large, open, suspicious looking boss arena. Compared to the first, the second encounter with Zubaji is one of the most difficult encounters in the entire game. It's been a while since we've been roadblocked by a boss, so I'm well up for it. This time the arena will be filled with sludge, which makes movement similar to walking in water, and it makes it more difficult to dodge attacks. He'll summon tornadoes which need to be avoided, and he'll zip around and the camera seems to have just given up caring at this point. In phase 2 he'll perform long delayed combos, and it took me a few tries to learn these patterns. Sometimes he'll turn into a slug at the end of his attacks, which looks pretty cool, but makes it really difficult to see what's going on. After a well-earned beating, he'll get annoyed and transform into a big black boar, and this is what frustrated me most about this fight. This boar will charge at you, which is hard to dodge by itself, but the floor now begins to erupt, which makes it difficult to move around the room. Showing off, he'll even transform into a catfish and swim around in the tar, and my absolutely least favourite attack, when he transforms into a pack of raging bulls, which I didn't manage to dodge even a single time. In isolation, these mechanics are fine, but the tornadoes, slowing mud, rhino form, catfish form, bear form, charge attacks, eruptions, all combine to make it really difficult to understand what the fuck is going on. This is also a good time to talk about a very big complaint, and probably the biggest single issue I encountered in the entire game. The delays with rolling and input lag. Even after completing the game, I still have no idea if this is a mechanic or a bug, but now and then you'll experience what I can only describe as input lag, and your rolls will take longer to execute, and the whole game seems to slow you down, which really throws you off combat timings, and makes it impossible to dodge with precision. Ironically, this tended to happen mostly in fights where dodging was important, and it seems to be caused by frame drops, which leads me to believe the input lag theory. While not a problem in the early game, this is something that rears its head a lot more often in the later chapters, and it's really immersion breaking. Afterwards, Zubaji looks into a mirror, goes mental, spits out a magic needle, and then gets captured for a second time. Off we go again. This time he'll be tied up like Frodo in Return of the King, and we're forced to fight Mother. She'll use ranged web attacks, which can be dodged by frantically rolling around, and when she uses her light beam you'll need to turn around or be caught in a sticky situation. Pun fully intended. This is what Zubaji was referring to in the previous cutscene, and turning the camera away from the boss will prevent this from happening. A lot of the boss's attacks are physical, and if you time it properly, you'll be able to manage to dodge and attack at the same time. Talents allow you to do this better, and allow you to weave combinations of attacks together while dodging in between, which looks and feels great, but it requires a bit of practice and skill. Overall, another fairly simple but enjoyable fight. The next bit, however, is not so nice. We've clearly angered the arachnid gods, and millions of tiny spiders begin filling every crevice and corner of the cave. I think I'm going to need a surfboard at this rate. After running away from my literal nightmares, Chapter 4 begins to change in tone and atmosphere, and now we're outside, heading towards the Temple of Flowers. And when I said Chapter 4 was long, I really meant it. The Temple of Flowers is the last location in Chapter 4, giving off similar forest vibes to the beginning of the game, but this time enemies are much harder, like these strange slugs in human clothing or long-necked tigers, because why not? There's also another suspicious looking boss arena here, but there's no one around. Maybe we'll be back later. After culling the tiger and slug populations, we're up against the final boss of Chapter 4, the 100-Eye Taoist, and this guy is absolutely no joke.
This, along with those relics inside him, shall free me of Kunlun's reign. Rest assured, darling, I'll avenge you. Now let go of your misery and rest in peace.
After a short cutscene, we're thrown into a royal rumble of insects. The animations of these guys fighting is incredible. The first part of this encounter is easy. After the boss hits 75%, the spiders get wrecked and retreat, leaving us to deal with the boss one-on-one. The 100-Eye Taoist is a mix between a centaur and a centipede. A centipede? If you actually sit down and think about it, this is terrifying. But I can't help but laugh when I see his tiny insect legs carrying him around the battlefield. Aesthetically, this fight is gorgeous. You can never go wrong with a meadow of flowers, blowing in the wind. Gameplay-wise, I hate it. I absolutely hate it. Another boss with camera problems, tracking issues due to the shape and size of the character model, and input lag problems because there's so much happening on screen. Most of the difficulty comes down to player skill, but it takes a while to learn the intricacies of this boss. When you die, and you will die, you'll restart at 75% HP again to avoid repeating the spider bit. But because you no longer have a meat shield, you'll always end up at a disadvantage when repeating this encounter. It's not a big deal, but I can't imagine many people would have beaten this on their first try. Once the centipede hits half health, sometimes more, sometimes less, he'll spit out a beam of energy, which turns the arena into a Daft Punk concert. And this is where the frustrations begin.
Die in the light and the sight of my eyes!
Now the boss attacks with electricity. He'll move faster while dealing even more damage, but the most annoying part about this is his levitate spell, and this causes rocks to float in the air before slamming down. Because the boss is so large, it's really difficult to gauge the depth of this mechanic, and this caused me to take a lot of silly damage. When you see an attack that you don't like the look of, the best thing to do is just to run away, screaming optional. After a while he'll disappear and shoot beams of lightning at you, which you'll need to dodge until he decides to show up again. While it's not impossible by any means, this boss literally felt impossible. And rather than forcing myself to spend another 4 hours trying to beat him, I decided to go straight to the secret arena in the hopes of getting an upgrade. What I didn't realize at the time though, Chapter 4's secret area might be harder than even the 100-Eyed Taoist himself. To get there you'll need to find and kill the Venom Taoist, who can be found down the one and only path I missed while exploring. He's really easy, and afterwards he'll retreat to the boss arena that we saw earlier. I knew this place was going to be used for something. Fight Venom again, and this time you can even chop his body parts off. Poor dude. Once defeated, he'll reveal a secret doorway on the wall, and now we can squeeze inside like that painting quest from Oblivion. Inside, we're treated to the gorgeous Purple Cloud Mountain. And as far as secret areas go, this one is probably the longest, and you'll need to fight 2 bosses this time.
Get lost. Don't disturb my drink.
The first boss that I encountered was the Scorpion Lord, and oh my god, I was not expecting this to be this difficult. When you first meet him, he'll be chilling on top of his house like a normal scorpion would. If you talk to him, he'll be non-aggressive, but he'll warn you not to touch his pots.
Oh, the nerve! You fur-face, I meant to let you pass, but you chose to ruin my day! Now, face your doom.
Oh, okay. This might be the single biggest mistake that I've made all week. He is not happy that we smashed his pots, and we're thrown into what I think might be the hardest fight in the entire game. And I'm not even exaggerating. It was so difficult that I literally gave up. I've not beaten him to this day, and I don't even care. I'm sure many of you are typing comments about how bad I am as we speak, but if you were to actually sit down and learn this boss, you'd need to also learn how to dodge and attack perfectly at the same time, which is difficult, even against trash enemies. I'm not saying this is bad, it's good to have ultra difficult optional encounters. Even if you break his pots and piss him off, you'll still be able to leave and come back later, so don't feel like you'll need to beat him straight away. I, however, will never be coming back, and you can't make me. Instead, I continued onward to the second boss. The Duskvale is again another extremely difficult encounter, and I'd place him somewhere between Captain Wise Voice and the Yellow Wind Sage. But this time we've got more tools at our disposal. For some reason the Duskvale begins at 75% health, and in phase 1 he'll use ranged attacks and jumping attacks, which are easily dodged. After some time, the Scorpion Lord pops in for a chat, which makes this phase completely trivial. Of course, Mr. Scorpion gets wrecked and never shows up ever again, and I wonder if we can even still fight him after this. Phase 2 is where the difficulty arises, and the Duskvale howls at the moon, and the arena is filled with blood and darkness. Now the boss performs a faster mix of ranged and melee attacks, and you'll need to spend time focusing on dodging as he hovers in the air, firing big needles of death at you. While this is incredibly difficult, I still like this boss. I like the aesthetics, and the feeling you get when you dodge his ranged attacks. With the right talents, dodging causes us to recharge focus points, and you'll have a lot of opportunity to dodge in quick succession, which in turn lets us use more heavy attacks. So this fight felt fair and fluid. Input lag again is a problem with this fight, and I'm not seeing any reason why. There's no debuffs or anything on my screen indicating a problem, and this just leads me to believe that this is a bug. Either way, it's incredibly frustrating to have to play around input lag in a game that's designed for precise movement and intense combat. I would go as far as to say that it completely ruined the atmosphere of this fight, and turned what would otherwise be a decent fight into something that I really didn't enjoy. After dismantling the Veilbreaker, you'll be rewarded with the Weaver's Needle, and this is another vessel, and this time it'll nullify the effects of lightning. This needle makes the 100-Eye Taoist fight a complete cakewalk, and after getting it I beat him on the first try. This makes me wary of the balancing in Wukong, because without this needle, this fight is extremely difficult, but then with the needle, it's a complete walk in the park, which turns the needle into more of a requirement rather than an optional secret. And not to mention that this secret is entirely missable, and something that I personally missed on my first run through this chapter.
Come down, Grandmaster. I need you.
With the Taoist gone, we're rewarded with some more delicious loot, and another magnificent animation as we move into Chapter 5. We're whisked away to the Woods of Ember, a vibrant, fiery location with an atmosphere unlike anything we've seen so far. This chapter is more linear, and considerably shorter than the other ones, and I'd place it as my second favourite, after Chapter 3. Chapter 5 is all about scenic, fast-paced action, which makes both the exploration and the combat engaging and exciting. More new enemies, axe-wielding giants, and zombies. These dead boys behave identically to the statues from Chapter 3, flailing wildly after death before crumpling to the floor. Round the corner and we're already fighting our first boss, amid boars, zombies and the occasional explosion for good measure. We'll find out what's causing this very soon. The Pale Arc's stalwart should be ashamed to call himself a boss, and after beating him, he'll very conveniently remember that we're actually allies. Now that he's friendly, we can talk to him, and he instructs us to find the king, who apparently has what we seek, presumably the 5th relic. According to the stalwart, the mountains have become infested with undead, and 5 elemental coffin carts have shown up. An evil group of shopping trolleys, causing death and destruction on the land. We encounter the first of these trolleys right away, and the stalwart wasn't kidding when he said coffin cart. While I appreciate the enemy variety, and the attempt at keeping combat feeling fresh, it baffles me as to why the developers thought that monstrous fire-breathing coffins with arms and legs would be good boss design. I'm not complaining though. I'm sure there's some sort of crazy lore behind this that would explain everything. I hope. Each of the 5 carts have slightly different mechanics, and while optional, they're going to get in your way whether you like it or not. The secret location of Chapter 5 is also locked behind defeating these carts, so you'll need to do it to progress. They have a serious amount of health, and trying to attack head-on is a death sentence, because as I learned very quickly, you'll be burned to a crisp. Despite having legs, they won't actually move around, so it's literally just a test of patience. Rather than dealing with this nonsense, if you look, you can see a green spirit next to the boss. This is another subtle hint showing us another way around, and rather than sacrificing any more of my precious time on this earth fighting this boss, I decided to skip it. Continuing onwards, we encounter another enemy trapped in a stockade, wandering around, and on death they'll explode. Lovely. It's nice to see Wukong still adding variety to its enemy design. Even after 40 hours played at this point, we're still fighting new foes. Compared to, say, Lords of the Fallen, where my biggest complaint was the lack of enemy variety, Black Myth Wukong feels much more engaging in that respect. Next up, another boss, the Father of Stones, who is so easy I'm not even going to bother talking about it. Then we get lost, blown up by archers, and eventually encounter a gorgeous valley and our second shopping trolley. This time it's the grey bronze cart, but we can't attack him until we get close. While short, this section is memorable and enjoyable, and the developers use this cave and its darkness as a mechanic, which is one of the first and only times in the game when you'll see this happening. To build on this feature, the developers have added interesting geometry to the cave to reduce visibility even further, and you'll find exploding enemies in hidden corners ready to ruin your day. When they explode, they'll illuminate the darkness with gorgeous red and yellow hues, and this is really cool to see. At the other end of some unexpectedly good level design, we come face to face with the grey bronze cart, and with no way around this time, we're forced to fight it head on. To get close, use the narrow mountains for cover. When in arm's reach, you'll have enough seconds to land some attacks, and then you'll need to run and hide. Repeat until dead. While not particularly challenging, these cart battles are almost like self-contained puzzles rather than skill-intensive boss fights, which adds even more variety to an already varied and interesting chapter. With no time to revel in our victory, a woman's voice pierces the air. These two knuckleheads are quick as fire and fast as wind, and I'm not even embarrassed to say that I haven't got a fucking clue what's going on anymore. While this one is very easy, it's also absolute chaos. It's a very memorable fight because it's like the developers decided to throw logic out of the window, and I'm absolutely ready for it. You'll be fighting both bosses at the same time. Quick as Fire rolls around on the floor doing very little, and Fast as Wind flies manically around the room. Both bosses zip around while spouting nonsense, and the whimsical background music perfectly complements the ridiculousness of this situation. Even the fox girl, still hanging from the tree, chimes in with her own thoughts. It makes me laugh just thinking about the fact that somebody had to actually sit down and develop this. Just sit back and listen. The easiest way to do this is to take out Quick as Fire first, then swap Fast as Wind out of the sky when he gets close. 100 out of 10. Absolutely would fight again. Now we're free to rescue Miss Fox, who introduces herself as Ping Ping, daughter of the Bull King, and her mother, Rakshasi, who we've not yet met. Ping Ping asks us to help her stop her brother, who's gone full Darth Vader and burned down half the mountain. She tells us of a magic fan with the power to blow away the inferno, and so, off we go to the fires of Mount Doom. Graphically speaking, Wukong has never stopped impressing me. And while I've been noticing more and more FPS hiccups, outside of this, the performance has been absolutely top-notch. Inside Mount Doom, we're introduced to some more enemies. The first, a hulking behemoth with a shield, just like in Chapter 2. Smash the shield first or take them from behind. No, that came out wrong. Our second new enemy is these Geodudes, which pop out of the ground unexpectedly. And even if you're sprinting as fast as possible, you can still be hit by them as they wake up. So you'll need to move erratically, which causes even more enemies to wake up. This will be fine in any other situation. But here in Furnace Valley, shrines are hard to come by. And if you die, well, be prepared for a really long corpse run. Oh, and the lava. Watch out for that too. Another duo boss. Sadly, this pair is a lot less interesting than the Rolling Head Circus that we've just fought, and I got stuck here for longer than I'd like to admit. Cloudy Mist uses ranged electrified laser beams, like Megatron, and at the same time, Misty Cloud tries to beat you to death with a wooden plank, dealing close-range physical fire attacks. You will never have to fight both bosses at the same time, but the difficulty of this encounter comes from the attacks which happen off-screen. When the bosses swap places, they'll usually attack at the same time. They might appear in front of you, behind you, or anywhere in the arena, and it's really difficult to track. If you die, you'll be forced to make the extra long corpse run again, which secretly is the whole reason why this fight frustrated me. Defeating this pair, we move on to another gorgeous interlude before immediately encountering another boss. I've got to commend the environmental design in this location, because it's really impressive. Rakshasi and her daughter Ping Ping are in the middle of some family drama, while we casually eavesdrop nearby, and eventually another dude shows up calling himself the Keeper of the Mountain. Unlike other keepers, this one wants us dead. This fight is another 2-in-1, and without a doubt, it's my least favourite fight in the entire of Black Myth Wukong. I hate this boss. I really, really hate this boss. I hate this boss more than the 100-Eyed Taoist. I hate this boss more than Captain Wise Voice. I would rather fight 2 Captain Wise Voices at the same time than fight this boss. Visually, this fight is incredible, and the whole room transforms into an arena with yin-yang aesthetics, complete with animated water. Mechanically though, there's a few things that pissed me off. In Phase 1, we're up against the Keeper of the Mountain, and if you remember in Chapter 3, my main concern of the Kanjin Long Dragon fight was the fact that it's frustrating to fight with a boss that doesn't stay still. Even though the boss can't fly, somehow this one is even worse. The boss uses an onslaught of ranged attacks, and then either teleports into the sky or off to the other end of the room, like some sort of interdimensional game of tag, and you'll never catch up quickly enough to do any meaningful damage. At around 60%, the boss summons an army of ads, melee enemies and ranged enemies, and they'll appear in a circle around you. You'll need to dodge a lot here to stay alive, and as we've just found out, dodging attacks off screen isn't very fun.
From yin and yang arises 2 sides. From land and sky emerges the divide. Now, you shall be feasted upon by my yin-yang fish.
What a stingy host! Such a meager fish. Hardly enough for a platter.
In Phase 2, the boss refills his entire health bar and reawakens as a catfish. And this is the reason why I hate this boss. He's large and he's fast, and if you've been paying attention, you'll know that this causes problems with hitboxes and the camera. The catfish moves erratically, even more than in Phase 1, and this time he'll use tail swipes as well, which prevents you from running around the back. Most of his ranged attacks are really easy to avoid, but there's one specific attack where he'll unleash a barrage of black balls from the sky, and this was made even more annoying by the fact that this attack is really obviously telegraphed. It's like the game is taunting me on purpose. I fought this boss quite a few times, and in that time I never managed to dodge this attack. But the worst part about it is getting hit, because you'll be hit by every single ball, one after another, and this is just embarrassing. Along with all of this, the FPS issues caused by the gorgeous water made dodging and rolling basically impossible, which doesn't actually make things worse because I can't dodge anyway. To sum this fight up, it's an amalgamation of every single problem we've encountered so far, all squeezed into one boss. Bad camera, bad hitboxes, annoying attacks, high health, 2 phases, FPS issues. The list is endless, and I just felt like I had very little agency with this fight, and no way to fight back. The only saving grace about this encounter was the fact that Phase 1 doesn't have to be repeated. 0 out of 10. I'd rather fight the Windy Boys again. After defeating one of the worst bosses in the game, we're off to the Ashen Pass, where we'll be caught in an episode of Ninja Warrior. Again, I'm questioning why or how this was considered to be good design. I mean, it's not bad design, it's just so strange to see it. It's another test of light puzzle solving and patience, and it's an iteration of the last time that we had to do this. Because now you'll need to fight enemies in the gaps, but it's much more fun to just let the ball smush them. I also tried to immobilize the ball, but results proved inconclusive. After winning Takeshi's castle, we're left with the final encounter of Chapter 5. Okay, technically 2 encounters. And after a conversation with an extremely large mountain goat, we're fighting the Red Boy, Ping Ping's brother. The Red Boy encounter is another divided opinion online. Personally, I really enjoyed this fight. This boss is the same size as us, which means we're on level footing, and while the mechanics are tricky, this made this encounter a lot more fun. Yes, this is another multiple phase fight. Yes, this boss induces FPS input lag. Yes, this boss has long range melee attacks. And yes, this boss also has camera problems because he doesn't sit still. But despite all of this, I still had fun. In Phase 1, the Red Boy is somewhat manageable. He'll occasionally zoom into the sky and shatter into a million pieces, and he'll fire himself at you piece by piece. Surviving this mechanic requires a degree of skill and patience. Because there's so many clones, you'll have trouble seeing what's coming next. After dying a few times to this, I finally discovered that running as far away as possible gives you a lot more time to assess the situation. Which is surprisingly simple, but also an interestingly unique mechanic. After depleting his health, he'll rise again in Phase 2, and if you die, you won't have to deal with Phase 1 again, which makes things easier. In Phase 2, he becomes the Yaksha King, and the difficulty boils over to an 11. The Yaksha King has a lot of memorable attacks. He'll use extremely long-range melee attacks with some difficult timings, and you'll really need to learn how to dodge these properly before beating the boss. Despite all of this, I still had fun because once you learn how to dodge and counter, you'll regain control of the fight. And being able to anticipate what's coming next and how to deal with it, despite the difficulty, this boss still felt fair. After 30 deaths and finally getting good, we beat the Red Boy and have an argument with the Bull King, grab the 5th relic and off we go to Chapter 6. Only one more relic to go. Chapter 6 brings us full circle, back to the familiar territory in the same forests from Chapter 1. With only one relic to go, I wonder if we're going to face off against some Wukong before the end. Chapter 6 has some new enemies. These teleporting electric rat henchmen are the Guardians of the Heavens, and while this chapter has very little trash, these guys will be popping in to say hello now and again. Alright, so I've got to be bluntly honest. When I reached this bit, I was seriously excited for Chapter 6. Because it's, the ending of the game. But in retrospect, unfortunately I think it's one of my least favourite chapters in the entire game, and I'll explain why very shortly. The Supreme Inspector is one of those bosses with the power to prevent you from enjoying life for several hours. Thankfully, I escaped mostly unscathed, but it's by no means an easy fight. He's got wings, which means another flying boss, so expect to see a lot of airborne shenanigans, where you'll spend most of your time waiting for your turn to attack. Just like the Black Bear, you can use Immobilize to knock him out of the sky, which interrupts his rhythm and gives you a chance to fight back. When grounded, the Inspector has an interesting mechanic. The boss will open and close his wings. When closed, he'll be completely invincible to attacks, just like Yellowbrow's golden form, so you'll need to carefully attack during periods when his wings are open. Eventually, he'll conjure bizarre spinning red circles, which fly around the room and look like, unicycles. Even more bizarre is when the boss decides to begin riding his new Christmas present around the arena. And I'll be honest, I really didn't see this coming. Visually, this fight is one of the best, and his standard lightning attacks are wrapped in a fiery red veil, a mechanic that's both visually stunning and distinct to look at. Eventually, he'll pull out the big guns, summoning a blazing ring of fire, and significantly reducing the amount of space that you'll have to dodge. Or, see. This one reminded me of the Yellow Wind Sage's tornadoes, but this one's easier to deal with because the boss will actually stay inside the ring, and this time we've got a lot more tricks up our sleeve to deal with this encounter. The main difficulty of this one comes from its attack timings. The boss's attacks are very clearly telegraphed, but there'll be a sneaky delay before he unleashes his lasers, and they fire extremely quickly. It's like the opposite of a delayed attack, and it really messes with my brain. Once the boss is dead, we're given our final spell, the Somersault Cloud.
Fortune's gift it is! It's Wukong's Somersault Cloud!
This spell is by far the most iconic spell in the game, and by pressing a button we can now literally fly around on a cloud. Come on, who doesn't want to be a cloud? I was actually surprised by how unrestricted this ability felt, but you'll be confined to only using it during Chapter 6, which was a shame. But, I can't imagine the rest of the game working very well if you could fly around like Harry Potter. And here's a fun fact. At the time of writing this review, according to the Steam achievement page, only 36% of players have actually unlocked the ability to fly, and that's almost a month after the game has launched. This means that over 3/4 of Wukong's players are still either in struggle purgatory or just gave up entirely. We're granted the freedom to take on the next 3 bosses in whatever order we choose, making Chapter 6 technically the first open world chapter of the game. Like I said, Chapter 6 has very little exploration, and you'll be moving from fight to fight in quick succession, like an airstrike. A baboon AC-42, if you will. The first 2 bosses are marked with lightning from the heavens, which is handy, and the game teaches us this subtly by having Zubaji fly towards it in a cutscene. Following onwards, I decided to go for the cloud-treading deer first, and looking back, I really wish I hadn't. The deer uses a combination of frost and wind magic, which means you'll have the chance of being frozen and knocked around, sometimes both at the same time. You can use the wind tamer to nullify these tornadoes, which is handy, but the deers will just summon more, and your vessel ability won't charge fast enough to keep up, so that one's out of the window. Mechanically, the attacks are very straightforward, and they can be learned with a bit of patience. Phase 1 isn't too bad, but Phase 2 brings a fresh new level of deer hell. Now he'll summon coagulated blood on the ground, and standing in this causes poison damage, because why not? Just look at how fast our poison meter fills up when you're standing in this mess. So on top of dodging melee attacks, charge attacks, frost spells, wind spells, you'll now also be playing hopscotch with poison puddles. My frustration peaked during this fight, simply because like most other bosses in Chapter 6, you'll get very little time to fight back, and it becomes frustrating just endlessly dodging while watching your health slowly chip away. In the end, I resorted to spamming heavy attacks, and this just made me feel like I was cheating, but at this point, I couldn't care less. My strategy boiled down to running around in circles, charging up a 3-point heavy attack while praying I wouldn't get smacked in the head, so it's mostly just a test of luck to see if you'll have enough time to run around and charge an attack. If you really wanted to go full cheese wheel, you could probably just leave this whole phase to Zubaji, but I shudder to think how long this would take. I spent about an hour here, and I definitely didn't enjoy it. It's firmly planted near the bottom of my best boss tier list, and sadly, most of the Chapter 6 bosses are also near the bottom of this list. Once defeated, the deer rewards us with our first piece of mythic armor, the armor of Wukong himself. We need to get all 4 pieces of armor, and Chapter 6 is basically a case of running around stealing things from animals, which is an interesting change of pace. I do a little more exploring and eventually find the second boss, the armored rhino. This one is very simple and he took very little effort, but he's got some interesting mechanics. Aside from his huge health pool, the rhino will be immune to most types of attacks that aren't aimed at his golden noggin. After a few hits to the snout, the rhino will be stunned for a short period of time, giving you a window to deal some damage. Particularly this fight, and chapter 6 in general, my frame rate was just screaming in pain. So much so that I ended up having to lower my graphics settings. And yes, a first world problem I know. Some of the earlier boss fights had frame drop issues, which I've already pointed out, but in chapter 6, the whole experience was plagued with this problem, which was a real shame. Defeating the Paul Rhino gives us our second piece, the chest. I got stuck trying to find where to go after this boss for a good few minutes. I couldn't see any more lightning in the sky, so we had no more breadcrumbs to follow. Eventually I found the third boss, and I used the word boss very lightly. It's not difficult, but oh my god, it's frustrating. As you explore the forest, you might bump into this large menacing cricket, just chilling in various spots. After resting for a few seconds, he'll leap to his next destination, and he'll do this continuously. Going near him does absolutely nothing, other than presenting an ominous health bar, and I was left scratching my head. The idea here is that you're supposed to hop on your cloud and land on his head, but you'll only have a few seconds to do this. Then you'll need to grab onto his antenna, and press the R2 button and hold on for dear life while the cricket continues on his journey. You'll need to do this 3 times, while your stamina slowly drains away. If you run out of stamina, you'll reset the pattern and you'll be thrown off. This is simple enough, but the UI prompts are really unclear. I wasn't sure if I had to hold R2 and then let go, or hold R2 for the full duration, and I kept falling off. This isn't a big deal, but when you fall off, the cricket will jump away, and you'll need to spend another few minutes looking for him across the map. This part took me nearly half an hour. After completing 3 iterations of this awful mechanic, you then need to pull on his poor tendrils while taking heavy amounts of fire damage. Either burn to death or beat the boss. This is a really strange interlude and essentially a health and stamina test. You literally cannot progress until you pass this exam. While I don't necessarily agree with this design, and I think this was a pretty frustrating encounter overall, in a positive light this encounter does serve the purpose of showing you the forest, and while chasing this annoying cricket you'll more than likely find something of interest, such as the many optional bosses that can be found throughout the level. So from a non-mechanical perspective, I can see why this fight was added. Alright, 3 pieces of armor collected, time for the 4th. Now this part is extremely weird, and this time I love it.
It's in me! It's in me! Kid! Help me out here! This is a tough swallow!
The next fight essentially takes place inside of Zubashi's stomach, and I'm assuming that we've been shrunk down to fit. While the premise and theme of this boss is actually one of my favourites, the boss itself is one of the worst. The reason why this boss is so painful to fight is because of 2 reasons. One, he's a boss with 2 phases, which means you've got one cutscene to begin the fight and another cutscene after he gets to 75% health. Phase 1 is easy. The only difficulty is the water, which slows you down. Or, I guess that's not water, but bear innards? In Phase 2 you'll have more of the same, but this time the boss will not stop attacking, like ever. He just won't stop. You can sit here desperately dodging for 10, 20, 30 seconds at a time, and it's really frustrating. On top of that, when you do find an opening to attack, he'll jump away after a few seconds, so even if you do manage to attack, trying to do a full combo is tricky, and as we already know, combos are how you see through the enemy, to avoid taking damage, so it's a catch-22. It's a bit of a shame, and after an hour or so, this fight essentially turns into the same process every single time. Deal with Phase 1 by using Red Tide transformation. Perform basic attacks and then a heavy attack. Do this twice. Then, 1 hit of Immobilize and onto Phase 2. Phase 2, use the Plantain Fan immediately. Summon your clones, and then summon your spirit. Once you've done this, you'll be close to killing the boss, but then it's just luck and a bit of praying. And this is just dumb. I shouldn't have to automate the boss to have a chance. Eventually we beat the Mantis and get to experience what it would be like to be vomited by a bear. And then with the 4th part of the set, we're off to the Water Curtain Cave for a really enjoyable ending to the game and an unusually large staff. Finally, we have all parts of Wukong's armor set, and now complete with the staff to top it off. Aside from looking awesome, this staff changes our attack patterns and animations, making them more powerful. Now we have the ability to perform some new final combo moves, and this is nice. And I reckon New Game Plus with this weapon would be quite enjoyable. We're now tasked with ascending the final mountain to visit Wukong himself. To test out our new abilities, we encounter an actual army of lightning warriors on the way up the mountain, and now we can just mow them down without a second thought. It's a nice cinematic way to show player progression and increase of power. At the peak, we find an old, long-forgotten monkey who takes us on a boat trip through the dreams and memories of Wukong. In this last cutscene, which, by the way, is incredible, we learn that the last relic isn't an object or a trinket. As the Destined One, we're finally ready to put together the other 5 relics to unlock the 6th and final one, the mind of Wukong himself. The final boss battle of the game is actually easier than I was expecting it to be, and considering all of the bosses we've fought to get here, it's not too bad. It is a really long fight though, and you'll need to slog through 4 phases in total, but we will get a checkpoint after phase 2. In phase 1, the stone monkey uses pretty easy to dodge attacks, ice, electric and fire, so getting hit will cause these status effects. His physical attacks are actually really slow and easy to dodge, and I'd recommend saving the majority of your abilities until phase 2. In phase 2, the monkey begins using a lot more elemental AoE attacks, firing shockwaves of lightning in circles. Sometimes these fly outwards and then back again, and you'll need to use the camera to keep track. At around 70% health, he splits into 2 versions of himself, which is just wonderful. One clone will perform attacks from phase 1, and the other attacks from phase 2, both at the same time. You'll need to take out one of the monkeys first, and then deal with the second one, so careful tracking of each one is required to make sure you're focusing damage properly. The plantain fan is really handy here to crowd control one of them while you take the other one on. Once you've defeated both stone monkeys, the fight transitions into phase 3. After that incredible cutscene, now we're fighting identical versions of ourselves. This time, the Great Sage will use spells similar to our own. Immobilize, Ring of Fire, and even the same combo attacks that we can use. And while this is difficult, it's a lot easier to get the timings of these attacks down because you'll already know them well, from using them ourselves throughout the whole game. In phase 4, he'll regenerate his life bar for one final phase. This time the monkey steals our staff and uses it himself, preventing us from using any 4-point abilities, which the boss would instead use. This is pretty rude. Using your gourd in this fight also triggers a small cutscene where the sage will steal our gourd from our hands, and this drains our gourd juices and heals him instead, which is emotionally upsetting, but also a really cool mechanic that I wasn't expecting. This whole fight is a culmination of abilities coming together for one final showdown against the same enemy, and it's really cinematic and a really enjoyable way to end the game. But the main reason why this fight was enjoyable is because unlike some other bosses that we've downed recently, you'll actually have time to attack. And it's a worthy end boss, and despite the difficulty, I really enjoyed this one, a lot more than the rest of Chapter 6. Once defeated, the Great Sage disappears like a fart in the wind, leaving behind the golden headband which is placed on our heads. With all of the relics, we become the new Wukong, destined to serve the heavens, and now the cycle is complete, ready to repeat over and over again. And that's not all though. Wukong is a large game, and while I've discussed the majority of the content, there's still a lot that I've not even talked about. To get the final secret ending of the game, you'll first need to beat the secret area in all 6 chapters, and then beat some final bosses. It's worth watching this final ending if you ever get the chance, because it changes the outcome of the story, and even hints at the possibility of some interesting DLC later down the line. Wukong has a total of over 100 bosses, which is an impressive number, and if you're itching for even more, you've also got New Game Plus, which will consume another 50 hours of your life. And so, with Wukong beaten and the Destined One victorious, I have to say, aside from mostly minor complaints that we've discussed in detail, I really enjoyed Black Myth Wukong, from the start to the finish. While the story wasn't something I was familiar with, the way it was presented was absolutely wonderful. The gameplay itself is very well put together. I've discussed both the positives and negatives already, but to sum up, Wukong is an incredibly well-made, enjoyable RPG, with the serious potential to become a contender for Game of the Year. There were things that I disliked about the game, such as some of the boss designs, and some of the reoccurring issues like the camera and so on, but if you're on the fence about this one, I'd wholeheartedly recommend giving it a go. These videos take hundreds of hours to produce, and while I enjoyed every second of it, I really do appreciate your support. So, if you did enjoy this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could drop a like or a comment, letting me know what you thought of Wukong. Drop a sub if you want to see more content like this in the future, and if you're looking to support me in other ways, check out my Patreon in the description. And, as always, happy gaming.